Welcome to the inaugural episode of Grand Rounds, the Healthcare Dollar. Join us in this podcast that breaks down complex healthcare finance topics for both patients and physicians, because you can't change a system until you understand it, and this system sure needs changing for everyone. I'm Dr. Kadari, a resident physician at John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas, and an MD graduate from the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School. In each episode, we will examine the various forces that influence healthcare finance, from billing at the bedside to boardroom decisions, and everything that lies in between. We explore topics such as hospital margins, insurance models, how doctors get paid, private equity, value-based care, and the hidden incentives involved in the system because they impact the care that clinicians can give and the care that patients receive. This podcast is designed for clinicians, patients, and anyone else eager to understand the business side of medicine, because when you follow the dollar, you find the why. Now, as I alluded to, the reason I believe that this is important is that so many physicians and patients don't know or understand the broader financial forces that shape their practice and care. Physicians don't realize that so much of how they're forced to practice, how many patients they have to see, their salaries, all of it, they don't realize how much of it depends on all of these healthcare finance topics. And patients don't realize the immense pressure that the system is under and doctors, leading to frustrating inefficiencies of care or even mistakes in their care. And so this is why it's important for both parties to understand. Usually the experts who are talking about healthcare policies and systems and finance and all of these things include CEOs, healthcare policy experts, lawyers, and other people who are commenting on issues which deeply impact clinical practice, although they don't practice clinically. So it's time that more physicians enter the conversation, and to enter it, you have to understand it, the basics at the very least, so that you can speak up wherever you are and whatever you do for what is right for your colleagues, your patients, and your practice. And if you don't sit at the table, someone else will. So some of the topics that you'll see are: what is value-based care? How does private equity impact medicine? What are the different types of insurance, and why does that matter to me as a physician or a patient? Why are healthcare costs so high? This one impacts everyone, guys. And what is an accountable care organization? That's a term I see around all over the place. Now, who am I? This is me, Dr. Kadari. I'm a family medicine resident at John Peter Smith Hospital. I'm no expert in healthcare finance. I have no formal training, but I do have a set of experiences that has led me to understand the world more so than others in the space while still having no formal training. And I think that gives me a unique way to explain some of these really complex topics in a basic way that everyone can understand. A little bit of background: I did a pretty interdisciplinary healthcare major at Vanderbilt University. I worked as an associate at Oxyon Health Partners, which is a healthcare growth services firm for companies that were private equity and venture capital backed in the healthcare space in particular. I worked as a project coordinator while I was in medical school at Southwestern Health Resources, an integrated accountable care organization forming physicians from UT Southwestern and Texas Health Resources, yes, that's correct, Texas Health Resources. I graduated with my MD from University of Texas at Southwestern. I chose to pursue my family medicine residency at John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas. And I also have spent time on the AAFP Commission for Quality in Practice, which is the American Academy of Family Physicians Commission, focusing on some of these issues. And it really gave me a unique lens into how much physicians can suffer when they don't understand the financial forces of the healthcare industry. So without further ado, as we truly have no time to waste, our first topic, and one that should really interest every physician and patient: how do doctors make money? The first thing to understand is just literally, how do they get the money? What happens when a patient shows up? This looks complicated, but it's really overall quite simple. When a patient shows up to any doctor, hospital, clinic, procedure, they will usually pay some sort of copay, an out of pocket cost. That goes straight into the provider, the doctor's finance department. The other part of this is that for everything that the provider did, so if they did a surgery or if they treated the patient for diabetes, there's a code for everything that they did. They make a list of all of the codes and they submit it to billing. It goes through a big old department of people who review it, and a lot of people who deny it. This is where the deny, defend, United Healthcare's famous slogan comes from. A lot of the game here is, doctors trying to prove that their patients need something and that they did a service that needs to be paid for. And insurance will and can turn around and say, well, we don't agree. We're not going to pay for that. So this is not always a one-to-one pipeline, but ideally it would be. Insurance would pay for that. It'd go to the bank, go to the finance department for this doctor, and from that they would pay all of their expenses, just like anyone else. So that's the overall revenue cycle management. How do the doctors actually get the money? Where does insurance come into this? This is the overall process. Now, insurance is a monolith of a word, and depending on who exactly the insurer is, depends on how much and how well they pay the doctors. So overall, insurance is the one who pays the doctors. There's lots of different kinds that can impact both a patient's care and a physician's practice. The two big categories are public financing, that's anything that uses taxpayer dollars, versus private financing, something that an individual or a family pays for and buys on their own. Under public financing, you have your big player, the center of Medicaid and Medicare. And we'll talk about the differences of those later, but that's one big insurer. It's actually the nation's largest single insurer between these two populations. This also covers the Veterans Healthcare Administration system and TRICARE that covers the military. And you've got your other government agencies. These all will act and are forms of insurance that pay doctors for the services that they provide. The other options are private financing, either healthcare insurance that you've bought on your own or that you've bought through your employer. All of that is basically private insurance, and those are obviously insurance companies that, again, pay your doctors for what they do. So who pays the doctors? All of these people. But the thing that differs is how much do each of them pay. And so, like I said, any one doctor could take some patients from, we'll go back for a second, they could take some patients from Medicare, they could take some patients from Medicaid, they could take some patients who have private insurance. And all of those insurance people pay the doctors differently. So doctors don't get one set rate. So to explain that a little bit more, Medicare, how much a doctor gets paid for whatever they do for a patient, and it could be the same. You could have the same diabetic patient who needs a ankle surgery. If they're on Medicare versus if they're on Medicaid versus if they're a private insurer, right? They have private insurance. The doctor that's doing the surgery for this diabetic patient gets paid different amounts based on that patient's insurance. So the base point kind of can be set as Medicare. The center comes up with a complicated formula that adjusts for a lot of things. It sets the reference point. Medicaid is state decided, and that usually tends to be only It only pays about 60 to 80% of what Medicare pays, which typically ends up in a loss for the doctor. And then everyone else, this is where the negotiations start, but typically commercial or private insurers will pay this doctor who does the diabetic foot surgery 1.5 to 4 times the Medicare rate. And let me remind you that even if you have private insurance, this and this matter because a lot of these costs are driven up when they're essentially covering the losses that happened here. So everyone is affected by doctors not getting paid as much for Medicaid. Everyone's affected by doctors getting not as paid as much for Medicare. And when I mean doctors don't get paid that much, it's not that their overall salaries aren't greater than the average population, but for their costs, they have to see a lot more patients for their practice costs to keep up with inflation. I say this because the fee schedule, this is an example of how you can understand what's happening in our country. Because our healthcare costs are going up, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare keeps putting pressure on physician salaries. So they really have not just not increased the physician fee schedule, but if you've account for inflation, the amount per patient that a physician baseline gets is actually about 20 to 30% lower than it was several years ago. And a lot of that is because healthcare costs have gone up. However, physician salaries are really just 20% of the healthcare costs. And right now, we're putting a lot of pressure on this that makes up 20% of this 4.5 trillion. There's no one easy answer to this, and there is a lot to be done in the world of physician payment reform. However, I think it's an important perspective to understand that all these $4.5 trillion are not going straight to the physicians. They're going to a lot of places. And part of this podcast is figuring out where those places are. So, if you're intrigued, stay tuned for the next episode.